The cold came down the mountain like a slow-moving river, pooling in the hollows and pressing against the pines. Rowan felt it first in the metal of the rifle slung over his shoulder, a chill that seeped through his jacket and settled deep in his bones. It was a familiar cold, the kind that smelled of wet earth and rust and the promise of an early snow. The air was thin and sharp, each breath a clean ache in his lungs. He moved with an economy born of long practice, his boots making little sound on the damp carpet of pine needles. The forest floor was a tapestry of decay and rebirth. Browns and golds shot through with the defiant green of moss on fallen logs. Light struggled through the dense canopy, dappling the trail in shifting patterns of gray and silver. The mountain wore its silence like a uniform, broken only by the whisper of wind through the high branches and the soft panting of the dog at his side. The dog's name was Sergeant. He was a German shepherd, black and tan, with the lean, muscular build of a creature designed for purpose. His coat was dense, catching the filtered light in subtle gradients. His eyes were dark and intelligent, not the warm, eager gaze of a pet, but the steady, assessing stare of a partner taking inventory of the world. He walked at Rowan's left heel, his position unwavering, a silent testament to years of training that had fused them into a single, cohesive unit. Rowan's own movements were just as disciplined. He was a tall man, broad-shouldered, with the compact strength that came from conditioning rather than vanity. His olive field jacket was worn soft at the elbows, a plaid shirt visible underneath. His face, framed by a rough, close beard and early silver at the temples, was a map of hard angles and quiet sorrows. His eyes, the color of a winter sky, were always moving, scanning the tree line, the path ahead, the shadows that clung to the undergrowth. He was a man who had learned to read the world like a threat assessment, a habit he couldn't shake, even here, in the supposed peace of the national forest. This was their routine, a patrol of the lesser-used trails, a task he'd volunteered for with the Forest Service. It gave him purpose. It gave him movement. It kept the four walls of his small cabin from closing in. Most days, the silence was a balm. Today, it felt watchful. Sergeant stopped. It was not a sudden halt, but a fluid deceleration, a gathering of tension in the animal's frame. He did not growl. He did not bark. He simply stood, head raised, nose testing the air. His ears swiveled, catching a sound Rowan could not hear. A low whine, barely audible, vibrated in the dog's chest. His tail, normally held in a relaxed curve, stiffened. Rowan stopped with him, his hand going not to his rifle, but to the dog's neck, feeling the taut muscle beneath the thick fur. He knew the signs. This was not the alert posture for a bear or a mountain lion. This was different. This was the signal for something wrong, something that did not belong in the natural order of the mountain. "What is it, boy?" Rowan murmured, his voice a low rumble absorbed by the damp air. Sergeant took a single step off the trail, his body angled toward a dense thicket of firs and rhododendron. He looked back at Rowan, his dark eyes holding a question and a command. Rowan trusted the dog's instincts more than his own. Sergeant had never been wrong, not once. Rowan followed, pushing through the wet branches, the cold water droplets soaking the sleeves of his jacket. The smell hit him then, faint but unmistakable beneath the dominant sense of pine and wet soil. It was the smell of old metal, of ozone, and the faint, acrid tang of stale fuel. It was a smell from another life, a ghost on the wind. The ground sloped downward, steeper now, the footing treacherous with loose rock and slick roots. Sergeant moved ahead, his steps certain, a dark shape navigating the gloom. Rowan followed the sound of the dog's passage, his own senses stretched taut. The air grew colder, heavier. The wreck watched them the way old debts watch from across a room. They found it in a small hidden ravine, a place the trail maps ignored. It was a transport plane, military by the look of it, its dark gray fuselage scarred and dented. It had come down hard, shearing through the tops of ancient pines, whose broken trunks now stood like sentinels around the crash site. Rust spread across the hull in jagged patterns, like a wound that refused to scab. Yet it wasn't fully decayed. It had been here for years, but not decades. Sergeant stood near the gaping hole of a torn cargo door, his body rigid. He did not enter. He waited. Rowan approached with caution, his boots crunching on shattered plexiglass. The silence here was different. It was heavy, weighted with the history of violence and a long, patient waiting. He ran a hand over the cold, riveted metal of the fuselage. No markings, no tail number. A ghost. He peered into the dark interior. The smell was stronger inside, a cocktail of decay, damp, and chemicals. He pulled a small flashlight from his pocket, its beam cutting a sharp white cone through the darkness. The light played over rows of empty seats, their harnesses neatly buckled. No bodies. No luggage. Sargent finally moved, stepping carefully over the threshold into the belly of the plane. He ignored the cockpit, ignored the passenger seats. He led Rowan toward the rear cargo hold. The dog stopped beside a stack of metal containers, the kind used for sensitive equipment or medical supplies. They were not scattered from the impact. They were stacked, neatly. Someone had organized them after the crash. Rowan's light found the straps that should have held them in place. They weren't broken. They were cut. He saw the wreckage of a Blackhawk, its rotors bent like wilted petals. He remembered the smell, the same smell, and the suffocating feeling of being too late. The weight of bodies he was supposed to protect. A wet nose pressed hard against his hand. Cold, firm, real. Rowan blinked, the desert sun receding, the gray light of the ravine returning. Sargent was looking at him, his head tilted, his gaze unwavering. The dog's presence was an anchor, pulling him back from the undertow of memory. "I'm okay," he said, the words tasting like ash. He took a steadying breath, the cold air a welcome shock. He stood up, forcing his focus back to the present, to the evidence. His light continued its methodical sweep of the cargo hold. It caught a glint of metal tucked beside one of the stacked containers, almost hidden in the shadows. It was a water bottle, an old aluminum one, dented and scarred. It was standard issue, the kind he'd carried for a decade, but it was what was wrapped around its neck that made his breath catch. A dog tag, looped through a broken chain. He picked it up. The metal was cold against his skin. He angled the flashlight, his hand surprisingly steady. The name was stamped into the metal, stark and clear. Thorn, Marcus. Rowan's heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic, trapped bird. Marcus Thorn. A handler, a friend. The man whose easy laugh had filled briefing rooms and makeshift FOBs. The man who had trained with a shepherd so intelligent they called him the Professor before he was officially named Sargent. He stared at the tag, the name a physical blow. This was Marcus's plane, and Marcus was dead. He had been for 5 years. Died in a training accident, they said. A helicopter crash during a weather squall off the coast. No survivors, no wreckage recovered. A neat, clean story. Rowan's gaze fell to the dog. Sargent was no longer looking at him. The shepherd was staring at the water bottle in Rowan's hand, a low, keening sound escaping his throat. It was a sound of grief. The dog stepped closer, nudging the dented aluminum with his nose, his posture subtly different. Not alert, not on guard. It was a posture of quiet recognition, a memory. Sargent remembered his first handler. The clean story was a lie. Marcus hadn't died at sea. He had died here, in this forgotten ravine. Or he had survived for a time. He had cut the straps. He had stacked the containers. He had waited. For what? For whom? for him. Rowan had been scheduled to meet Marcus that week for a joint training exercise, an exercise that was abruptly canceled the day before Marcus's accident. Rowan had been reassigned, sent on a last-minute deployment. He'd learned of Marcus's death via a sterile email 2 weeks later. He hadn't questioned it. He just accepted it. Another loss in a long line of them. Another name to carry in the silent pack of his guilt. The weight of the dog tag in his hand felt immense. A small piece of metal that connected the ghosts of his past to the cold reality of his present. Marcus had been here. He had survived the crash. And someone had gone to great lengths to make it seem like he, and this plane, had simply vanished into the ocean. A branch snapped outside. Instinctively, Rowan clicked off his flashlight, plunging the cargo hold into near-total darkness. He moved to the edge of the torn doorway, pressing himself against the cold fuselage. Sargent was already there, a silent shadow at his side, his body a coiled spring. They waited, listening. The sound came again, closer this time. The crunch of boots on gravel. It was coming from the service road, a place no casual hiker would be. Rowan's mind raced. Whoever had sanitized this site, whoever had covered this up, could be coming back. He heard the low rumble of a vehicle engine, then the squeak of brakes. A car door opened and closed. A single set of footsteps approached, unhurried, familiar. "Rowan?" a voice called out, calm and low. "You up here?" Rowan recognized the voice. Elias. He ran the garage and auto body shop in the small town at the base of the mountain. A fellow veteran, though from a different war, a different service. They rarely spoke of it. They didn't have to. Elias was a quiet man who understood the geometry of solitude. Rowan stepped out of the wreck, blinking in the gray afternoon light. Elias stood a few yards away, his old Ford truck parked on the overgrown service road. He held a large, silver thermos. He wasn't looking at Rowan, but at the massive, impossible shape of the downed plane. His expression was carefully neutral. "Figured you'd be up here," Elias said, his gaze finally shifting to meet Rowan's. "Storm's coming in. Brought coffee." It was a ritual between them. When the weather turned, or when one of them had been out of sight for too long, the other would appear with a thermos. It was an unspoken system of checks and balances. Elias's presence now was not a coincidence. He had seen something, or heard something. "It's not a weather plane," Rowan said, his voice flat. Elias nodded slowly, his eyes taking in the scene, the sheared trees, the rusted hull, the look on Rowan's face. "No," he said, "it's not." He unscrewed the lid of the thermos, which doubled as a cup, and poured. The steam rose in a fragrant cloud, smelling of dark roast and a quiet, dependable friendship. He poured a second cup. He didn't offer it, just set it on the hood of his truck, a silent invitation. Rowan walked over, taking the cup. The warmth seeped into his cold hands. He didn't speak, just held the dog tag in his closed fist, the metal pressing into his palm. Elias leaned against the truck's fender, sipping his coffee. He didn't ask what it was or how Rowan had found it. He just waited. His silence was a form of respect, a space for Rowan to fill if he chose. "I knew the man on board," Rowan said finally, the words feeling like stones in his mouth. Elias looked from Rowan to the dog, who now sat patiently by the truck, his gaze fixed on the wreck. "The dog did too," he observed. It wasn't a question. Rowan nodded, his throat tight. He opened his hand, showing Elias the tag. Elias glanced at it but didn't reach for it. He just looked back at Rowan, his expression unreadable but for a deep-seated empathy. The unspoken connection passed between them, a shared understanding of loss, of duty, and of secrets that refused to stay buried. "What are you going to do?" Elias asked, his voice low. Rowan looked at the ghost plane, then at the name in his hand. "The right thing," he said, "for once." He had been late for Marcus in life. He would not be late for him in death. Rowan did not call the sheriff. Local law enforcement was too easily deflected, too susceptible to pressure from higher up. Instead, he called a number he hadn't used in years. A contact within the Forest Service's investigative branch. A man who owed him a favor. He kept the details sparse. a downed, unmarked aircraft on federal land. Evidence of long-term survival, potential military connection. He mentioned no names. They arrived less than 12 hours later. Not the gruff, flannel-clad Rangers Rowan expected, but a clean, quiet convoy of black SUVs that looked alien on the muddy service road. A man in a tailored suit stepped out of the lead vehicle, his polished shoes sinking slightly into the soft earth. He was of medium height, with a well-groomed, reassuring appearance and a smile that never quite reached his eyes. "Mr. Rowan? I'm Mr. Vance with Aegis Recovery," he said, extending a hand. His grip was firm, dry, and brief. "We appreciate you calling this in. We'll handle it from here." Aegis Recovery, a corporate name, not government, not military. Rowan's internal alarm, always on low, began to hum at a higher frequency. Sargent, sitting by Rowan's truck, let out a low, almost inaudible rumble in his chest. "This is a military aircraft," Rowan stated, not making it a question. "It was," Vance corrected smoothly. "Part of a transport fleet that was decommissioned. We're the civilian contractors tasked with managing and recovering these assets. This one, unfortunately, was involved in a tragic training accident some years ago. We've been searching for it ever since." His tone was one of practiced sympathy, the kind used to placate grieving families and nosy reporters. Another person emerged from the SUV, a woman in her late 30s, with sharp, intelligent features and a weary professionalism in her eyes. She wore practical field clothing, a stark contrast to Vance's corporate armor. "This is Dr. Eris Thorne," Vance said. "She's a forensic anthropologist who consults for us on these sensitive cases. She'll be overseeing the technical side of the recovery." Dr. Thorne nodded at Rowan, a flicker of something, assessment, maybe caution, in her gaze. She looked past him, her eyes locking on the wreck, and a profound sadness settled over her features. "You found evidence of survival," Rowan said, directing the statement at Vance, but watching the doctor. "Yes, your report was very detailed," Vance said, his smile unwavering. "It's not uncommon in these situations. A pilot disoriented after a crash, acting on instinct, setting up a camp. It's a sad final chapter. Grief can make a person do remarkable things before they succumb." "He didn't succumb," Rowan said, his voice hard. "He was organized. He stacked supplies. He cut himself free. He was waiting for rescue." Vance's expression softened into one of deep, condescending pity. "Mr. Rowan, your service record indicates a great deal of field experience. I'm sure you've seen your share of trauma. You know as well as I do that the mind can play tricks. Hope is a powerful and often misleading instinct." At that moment, Sargent stood up. He didn't bark or growl. He simply moved, positioning himself between Rowan and Vance. He stood with his head lowered slightly, his shoulders broad, a solid wall of black and tan fur. His gaze was fixed on Vance, a silent, unequivocal statement of warning. Vance's smile faltered for the first time. He took a half step back, a flicker of genuine unease in his eyes before he masked it with a dry chuckle. "A very protective animal, commendable." "He's a good judge of character," Rowan said quietly. "The pilot's name was Marcus Thorne," Rowan continued, his eyes on Dr. Thorne. Her head snapped up, her professional composure cracking. Her face went pale. Vance placed a gentle, proprietary hand on her shoulder. "Yes, Dr. Thorne is Marcus's sister. This is, as you can imagine, a very difficult and personal recovery for her, which is why we need to proceed with the utmost discretion and efficiency." He was using her grief as a shield, a tool to shut Rowan down. "Discretion?" Rowan countered. "Or secrecy? This plane wasn't decommissioned. It was active, and it wasn't a training accident." Vance's eyes hardened, the polished veneer thinning. "Mr. Rowan," he said, his voice dropping to a low, confidential tone. "I've reviewed your file. Commendable service. A few difficult moments toward the end. A difficult transition to civilian life. A man like you values his privacy. We value ours. Let's agree to respect that." It was a threat, wrapped in the language of mutual understanding. He was referencing Rowan's sealed military record, the incident that led to his discharge, the failure he ran from every day. He was telling Rowan that the same system that buried Marcus's plane could just as easily bury him. "I want to see my brother's personal effects," Dr. Thorne said, her voice shaking but firm. She shrugged off Vance's hand. "His logs, his gear." "Of course, Eris," Vance said smoothly, his focus shifting to her. "Everything will be collected, cataloged, and turned over to you. We just need to secure the site first, for your safety." He was lying. Rowan could see it, a subtle tightening around Vance's eyes, the way he angled his body to block Eris's view of the plane. They weren't here to recover Marcus. They were here to erase him. "Relax, Sergeant," Rowan said, placing a hand on the dog's back. "It's a trail inspection, not an invasion." The dry humor was a thin piece of armor, but it was all he had. Vance's team began to move, unspooling yellow tape, setting up equipment with a cold, impersonal efficiency. They were sealing off the ravine, claiming it. Rowan knew he was being dismissed, pushed to the perimeter. He had brought the truth to light, and now the darkness was moving in to smother it. He caught Dr. Thorne's eye one last time. He saw fear, yes, but also a spark of defiance. She knew something was wrong. She was an ally, whether she knew it yet or not. But she was trapped inside their system, and he was now firmly on the outside. They barred him from the site, citing federal jurisdiction and the sensitive nature of the recovery. Rowan watched from a distance as Vance's team worked under portable floodlights, their movements precise and methodical. They were not salvagers, they were a cleanup crew. He retreated to his cabin as the cold rain finally began to fall, a steady, mournful drumming on the metal roof. He went back before dawn the next day. The rain had stopped, leaving the air washed clean and smelling of pine and wet stone. The black SUVs were gone. The yellow tape was gone. He walked down into the ravine, Sergeant at his heel, a knot of dread tightening in his stomach. The site was sterile. The cargo hold of the plane was empty. The stacked containers, the cut straps, the small, pathetic fire pit, all gone. Even the scuff marks on the floor seemed to have been scrubbed away. They had stripped the wreck of any evidence that a human being had survived within it. They had erased Marcus's last stand. Rowan stood in the hollowed-out fuselage, the silence now truly empty. The wreck was no longer a shelter or a tomb. It was just a piece of trash, an inconvenient secret waiting to be chopped up and hauled away. Vance's system had worked exactly as designed. His phone buzzed, a startling intrusion in the quiet. A blocked number. He answered. "They took everything," a woman's voice said, low and urgent. Dr. Eris Thorne. "His personal logs, a hard drive. They told me it was all compromised and had to be sent to a secure lab for analysis. It's a lie. They're burying it." "I know," Rowan said. "Vance has me on a short leash. He's hinted that my professional credentials could be reviewed if I complicate the process." "My brother was a whistleblower, Rowan. I'm sure of it. He was trying to expose something Aegis was doing. This plane crash wasn't an accident." "Can you prove it?" A sigh full of frustration. "Not without his logs. They were encrypted, but I have the keys. He sent them to me a week before he disappeared. He told me to keep them safe. I didn't understand then." The call crackled with static. "I have to go. They're watching me. Be careful. They know who you are." The line went dead. Rowan lowered the phone, the feeling of helplessness a cold poison in his veins. He had failed again. He had brought the truth to the light only to watch it be snatched away by men in suits. The old guilt, the one he kept at bay with long walks and hard labor, came roaring back. He saw the Black Hawk again, spiraling in the Afghan sun. He remembered the garbled radio transmission, the desperate call for support. He remembered his own hesitation, a 30-second delay while he cross-referenced intel that felt wrong, a gut feeling he had ignored in favor of protocol. By the time his team arrived, it was over. He had been too late, just like he was too late for Marcus. He retreated to his cabin, the mountain's beauty now feeling like an accusation. He pulled a bottle of whiskey from a high shelf, a bottle he hadn't touched in years. The first swallow was fire, a welcome obliteration of thought. He drank until the sharp edges of his guilt began to blur. A knock on the door. He ignored it. The knock came again, firmer this time. "Rowan?" It was Elias's voice, muffled by the thick wood. "Saw the lights were out, just checking in." "Go away, Elias," Rowan slurred, staring into the amber liquid in his glass. He heard the sound of the door handle turning. He'd forgotten to lock it. Elias stepped inside, a bag of groceries in his hand. He took in the scene. Rowan slumped at the table, the bottle, the look in his eyes. Elias's face showed no judgment, only a deep, quiet concern. "Just leave it," Rowan said, his voice raw. He didn't want the help. He didn't deserve the company. He wanted to sink, to be left alone with the ghosts he had earned. Elias hesitated for a moment, then set the grocery bag on the counter. He didn't say a word. He just looked at Rowan, then at the dog lying by the cold fireplace, and quietly let himself out, closing the door softly behind him. The silence he left behind was heavier than before. Rowan put his head in his hands, the self-loathing a physical weight. He had pushed away the only person who had ever approached his solitude with respect. He had proven Vance right. He was just another broken soldier, drowning in a past he couldn't outrun. He felt a heavy weight on his knee. He looked down. Sargent had come to him, laying his massive head on Rowan's leg. The dog's dark eyes were fixed on his face, patient, unwavering. He did not judge the whiskey on Rowan's breath or the tremor in his hands. He was simply present, a solid, living anchor in the swirling chaos of Rowan's mind. The dog whined softly, then got up, walked over to the corner where Rowan had dropped his field pack, and nudged it with his nose. He returned to Rowan's side and stared at him, expectant. After a moment, he did it again, more insistently this time. Rowan's fog-addled brain slowly processed the command. He stumbled over to the pack and unzipped it. Inside, wrapped in a spare cloth, was the dented aluminum water bottle. The one piece of evidence he had kept. Sargent nudged the bottle, then looked at Rowan. The message was clear. "It's not over. We're not done." The dog's unshakable loyalty cut through the whiskey, a clean, sharp blade of shame and resolve. Rowan looked from the dog's steady gaze to the water bottle in his hand. He pushed the whiskey away. The dog's insistence did not end with the water bottle. Through the long, sober night and into the gray light of morning, Sargent was restless. He paced the small cabin, his claws clicking softly on the wooden floorboards. He would stop, listen, and then resume his patrol of the perimeter. Finally, he stopped in front of the small pantry off the kitchen, a space that held canned goods and old equipment. He sat, rigid and alert, staring at the floor. Rowan, his head aching from a hangover and lack of sleep, watched him. "There's nothing in there but spiders and dust, boy." Sargent didn't move. He lowered his head and sniffed intently at the seam of one of the wide plank floorboards. Then he pawed at it, a single deliberate scratch. He looked back at Rowan, his gaze intense. Rowan sighed, but he knew better than to ignore the dog. He grabbed a pry bar from his toolkit. The floorboard was old, secured with handmade nails. It resisted, groaning in protest, before finally coming loose. Beneath it was not dirt, but a hollow space. And in that space sat a small, waterproof case, the kind used for marine flares. It was old, but the seal looked intact. A name was written on the side in faded marker, Henderson. Rowan knew the name, Old Man Henderson, the retired park ranger who had owned this cabin before him. A legendary curmudgeon who, people said, knew every rock and tree on this mountain better than the lines on his own hand. He'd passed away a few years before Rowan moved in. He opened the case. Inside, nestled in foam, was a handheld digital audio recorder and a small leather-bound logbook. Rowan opened the book. The pages were filled with Henderson's spidery handwriting. Dates, times, atmospheric conditions, and notes. He flipped through the pages, his heart beginning to pound. Henderson had been tracking a ghost. For years, he'd logged sightings of an unmarked, low-flying aircraft that didn't appear on any official flight plans. He'd noted its trajectory, its engine sounds. He thought it was some kind of clandestine government operation. 5 years ago, the entries became more frequent, more urgent. The last entry was dated the day before Marcus's plane went down. It read, "They're hunting it. Saw 2 unmarked helos, fast and low, near the Black Ridge. Not ours. Something is coming to a head. Rowan picked up the audio recorder and pressed play. Static hissed, then a voice, Henderson's, old and gravelly, spoke. Recording comms traffic, local band, unencrypted, fools. A moment of silence, then the airwaves crackled to life. He heard Marcus Thorne's voice, calm under pressure, reading off coordinates. Declaring an emergency, dual engine flameout, not an accident. I repeat, this is not an accident. I am being forced down. Another voice, distorted and cold, broke in. Transport 739, you will alter your course and comply. Do not transmit again. Then, chaos. The sound of alarms, the roar of a dying engine, and Marcus's final, defiant transmission. Tell Eris, the package is live. Aegis Protocol. God, forgive. The recording ended with the deafening shriek of metal tearing apart. It was all there. Proof that Marcus was a whistleblower. Proof that he was forced down. Proof that Aegis, Vance's company, was directly involved. Old Man Henderson, in his quiet, obsessive way, had caught the truth from the air and buried it under the floor for someone to find. Sargent had smelled the lingering scent of the past, the faint trace of Henderson's long-gone presence, and led him right to it. Rowan made 2 calls. The first was to Dr. Eris Thorne, playing her the recording of her brother's last words. There was a long, choked silence on the other end, then a single, whispered, "I'm on my way." The second call was to Elias. "I need you," Rowan said, no preamble, "and anyone you trust." Within an hour, they were all gathered in Rowan's small cabin. Eris, her face pale but her eyes burning with a cold fire. Elias, his presence a steady, calming influence. With him were 2 other men, older veterans from the town, their faces weathered and serious. They listened as Rowan played the recording again. Eris, her voice tight with grief and rage, explained what she knew. Aegis Protocol was my brother's name for a project he discovered. Aegis Recovery was using their government contracts to transport illegal arms and technology for corporate clients. They used decommissioned military planes, ghost flights, to move the assets. Marcus found out. He gathered evidence. The package he mentioned must be the data on the hard drive they took from the wreck. So they forced him down to get it back, one of the old veterans grunted, and left him for dead. But he didn't die, Rowan said. Not then. He survived, and he hid that hard drive somewhere in the wreckage. That's what Vance's team was really looking for. Elias, who had been listening intently, spoke up. Henderson mentioned helicopters. I know a guy, a hunter. Spends weeks up in the high country. Let me make a call. He stepped outside. They worked through the night, assembling the pieces. Eris used her expertise to analyze the technical data from Henderson's logbook, corroborating it with the flight path Marcus had broadcast. The other veterans worked their own quiet networks, looking for anyone else who might have seen something that day. The cabin, once a symbol of Rowan's isolation, became a command center fueled by coffee and a shared, righteous anger. As the first hint of dawn touched the sky, Elias returned. The hunter saw them, he said. 2 black helicopters, no markings, landed in a clearing about 5 miles from the crash site, the day after the crash. They were on the ground for an hour, then left. He thought they were special ops. He has photos. It was the final piece. Aegis hadn't just forced Marcus down. They had sent a team in on foot to recover the hard drive and sanitize the site, leaving Marcus to die of exposure. But they hadn't found the drive. Marcus had hidden it too well. And Vance's return, prompted by Rowan's call, was their second chance to find it and erase the last loose end. They had everything they needed. The audio, the logs, the eyewitness testimony, the photos. As Eris compiled it all onto a secure drive, Rowan felt a hand on his shoulder. He looked up. It was Elias. You didn't have to do this alone, you know, Elias said, his voice soft. Their eyes met, and in that moment, the exhaustion and the guilt and the years of running seemed to fall away. Rowan felt a warmth spread through his chest, a quiet settling he hadn't experienced since before the wars, before the losses. It was a feeling of not being adrift. He couldn't find the words to respond, so he just nodded, a single grateful motion. Eris looked up from her laptop. "We don't go to the press," she said, her voice firm. "They'll just bury it in a news cycle. I have a contact on the House Armed Services Committee, a staffer I trust. We give it to them. We let the system they exploited be the system that exposes them." It was the right call. Not a blaze of glory, but a quiet, irrefutable presentation of the truth. Rowan looked at the small group assembled in his cabin, at the dog resting his head on Eris's foot, and realized he was no longer alone in the fight. He had chosen to stay, and in doing so, had found a community he never knew he was missing. The aftermath was not a clean victory. It was a slow, grinding process of investigations and hearings. Mr. Vance disappeared, likely reassigned or retired by the powerful people behind Aegis. The corporation itself was forced to surrender several government contracts, a financial blow but not a mortal one. The system that created them remained, wounded but intact. Change was incremental, imperfect, but the truth about Marcus Thorne came out. He was not the victim of a tragic accident, but a hero who had died trying to expose corruption. His name was cleared, his honor restored. Eris, in a quiet ceremony attended only by Rowan, Elias, and a few of Marcus's old teammates, received his posthumous medal. She held it not as a symbol of loss, but as a testament to her brother's unwavering integrity. Rowan did not leave the mountain. The urge to run, to find a new solitude, had vanished. He had found his place, not in hiding from the world, but in guarding a small piece of it. He accepted a formal position with the Forest Service, consulting on trail security and backcountry safety. He walked the same paths, but his purpose was different now. He was not running from ghosts. He was standing watch for them. He was sitting on his porch one evening, the air crisp with the coming autumn. The mountain stood silhouetted against a sky painted in shades of orange and deep purple. He was watching the light fade, a quiet peace settling over him. It wasn't the absence of scars. He knew they would always be there, but a newfound ability to live with them. He had stopped trying to outrun his past and had instead chosen to carry it, to honor the weight of the names and faces that lived within him. At his feet, Sargent was asleep. Not the light, vigilant doze of a dog on duty, but a deep, untroubled slumber. His head was on his paws, his chest rising and falling in a slow, steady rhythm. His work, for now, was done. He had led his human back from the brink, had unearthed a buried truth, and had finally brought peace to the memory of his first handler. He rested, a loyal soldier in a time of peace. The familiar rumble of a truck engine broke the silence. Elias's old Ford pulled into the drive. He got out, holding 2 steaming mugs. He walked up the porch steps and handed one to Rowan without a word. It was coffee, dark and strong, just the way Rowan liked it. Elias sat in the chair beside him, and the 2 men watched the last of the light bleed from the sky. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. The silence between them was comfortable, filled with an unspoken understanding that ran deeper than words. It was a friendship forged not in conversation, but in shared presence, in quiet acts of loyalty, in showing up when it mattered most. It was an anchor in the turbulent waters of a life Rowan was finally learning to navigate. Sometimes the Lord doesn't send a whirlwind or a burning bush. Sometimes he sends a quiet friend with an extra cup of coffee. Sometimes his voice isn't in the thunder, but in the steadfast presence of a loyal dog who refuses to let you surrender to your own darkness. The greatest miracles are often the ones that arrive without fanfare. The friend who stays, the truth that endures, the quiet courage to face another dawn. Rowan looked at the darkening mountain, a silent guardian, and felt not the ache of what was lost, but the profound, quiet grace of what remained.